Hello everyone and welcome back to day 54 of 100 Days of Code with me, Lilly Code. Today what we're going to be doing, because as you know yesterday we finished the Kubernetes tutorial we had been doing, so I'm going to go back to Max's React project and continue on with my React. So that's the plan for today. So this is where we left off in Max's project. We were building out this form validation. So we were just building out a form and we were adding validation to it. So I'm going to pick up exactly where we left off. This was on day 44. So day 44 we left off here, and look, on day 54, 10 days later, we are back to where we had left off on day 44. We did some Kubernetes in between. So let's continue here now and see what's going on. So we have our email and our names added here. If we submit, we have a validation message telling us that our name cannot be blank, but we haven't got anything coming up for email. So that's what we're about to configure right now. Okay. So as we can see here, as always with these ones, I watch the video, Max's video, and then I code myself, and then I explain what's going on as I'm following through with the complete React tutorial by Maximilian, so which is linked in the description box down below. So what I've already done, what I did last time, was I copied the email input. We had our name input and we were creating a new email input. So let's go. So therefore we just need to continue to set up this email input to include these different handlers and stuff, because we're going to need them. Okay, so let's just check that we have those state management being tracked. So here we have our entered name and our entered name touch, but we're creating our second validation for our second field here. So we're going to need the same for email. So if we copy this and have two extra states being managed here, one for our email, our entered email, and one for our whether or not the input box was touched for our email, for our email box, for our email input. So we will add that in as well. So that's what this touched one is doing, is telling us whether someone has put their mouse into this email box. So there we go. And then this is going to be set entered email, and the same is going for the function that's changing the state of this variable that we're tracking. So set entered email touched. So cool. Now we have them ready. So I also need to create these handlers. So I'll create the same that I have for the name here, but just for an email. So I'll say const email input. There we go. Email input change handler. Yeah, we're going to take in an event, and we want this to just be an arrow function, and what we want to happen is just switch that variable that we're tracking, the boolean. So now we have set entered email, and we will pass through event.target.value. So once we have an email entered, we can switch on that boolean to say whether or not we did indeed set the email. So actually, in this sense, entered name and entered email is not a boolean, it's a string. So we're going to replace the empty string with the string that we have typed in. So here we're replacing an empty string with the event.target.value. So if we do indeed have a value saved in the entered email, which is here, and we change that with the set entered email function. So by using this function that's declared in the use state, we have the variable and the function. The variable is here, and then the function that we use to update this variable comes second in this array when we're declaring use state. And we've defined our initial state as an empty string, just an empty string. So what we're doing down here is when we have done something with the input when we've done something with the email input, so this is the change handler that's going to run when we do something with that email box, so when we start typing something in, and what we want to do is to capture the event and set the entered email, so change this variable here to be the event.target.value, so what was actually typed into that box. So that's what we're doing, and now we just need to make sure that this email input change handler is being called on that email box. So here we go, on change, run the email input change handler. Perfect. So we'll also just create our email input blur handler as well. So that's just if we put the mouse into that box. So we have our name input blur handler here, and we'll also have our email input blur handler. So I'll say const, and it's going to be following the same format, const email input blur handler. And we just want to do the same thing but for the email. So we'll say email. So what we want to do now as well is once we have actually submitted this and we've pressed the submit button, we want to also reset these back to false like we have done for the name. So we need to do the same thing for the email here, just to say like, okay, that's good, we can set it back now that we have submitted and we've passed through that value. Let's set it back to a clean slate. So we'll say set entered email here, and then set entered email touched here as well. There we go, and we'll save that. Great. Okay, so we're also just going to add some more validation checks here, or just a validation check, because for the moment we have this check, well, this boolean that is true if the entered name is valid, and if it's not true, if it's not the case, then this will be set to false. So we want to create something similar for our email field. So we'll have a const email entered email is valid, and we will equal this to entered email, and we will just say dot includes an @ symbol, because we're checking for slightly different things regarding an email or a name. So for the name, we just made sure that something was indeed entered, and for the email, we're doing very basic validation just to check if there's an @ symbol within the email, but it's a good starting point, so that'll be fine for now. And we'll also just add one to check if it is invalid. So if this is true, we know it's invalid, so we'll declare const entered email is invalid, and what this will be based off is if the entered email is valid is false. So that's fine. Yeah. And we'll also just check if that field has been touched. So And now we can actually use this, so yeah. Okay, so then we can do something similar to what we have here for our named input classes. So we'll do the exact same thing. We have our name there, and then we'll have our email input classes here. So email input class, oh, what did I do there? So email input classes, and here we're going to have entered email is invalid, yes. So in the case that the entered email, entered email is invalid, then we want to do the same thing. If it's invalid, add the class name invalid, and if it's not valid, if it's valid, then if it's not invalid, excuse me. So what we're checking for here now is if it's invalid. If it's true, if that's true, so the form is indeed invalid, we apply these first two classes to our input box. So the invalid class name is getting added, which is adding in some CSS there. Then we have, in the case that it is false, so the form is valid, we will just add form control and not add the invalid class, which will not add the CSS. So that's what we're doing here now. Okay. So yes, of course. Okay. So then we have email input classes. Okay. So we can also use down here, we have this error message showing. And what we want to show is indeed this. If the email input is invalid, then show us this message. Please enter a valid email address. So let's just make sure. So we've called this something else up above. We have called it entered email is invalid. So this same boolean should show and hide the error message. So if we save that now, and what else is wrong? So we have reference error, email input is invalid, and this is coming from line 73. Okay, let me just zoom in here. Okay, so we have this reference error, and it's saying line 73 of our simple input. Let's just reload to make sure. Let's type in an invalid email and a name. Okay, great. So we have our please enter a valid email address. Great. Anything going on in the console? Cool. And we also have our coloration happening, so that's great. Let's just leave the name blank for the moment and add and try and submit. We can't submit. Let's add in an @ symbol, which should make that valid, because that's all that we've specified for the moment. And then I'll just type in a name. Okay, cool. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Still some strange behavior, but we're getting somewhere, you know. This didn't give us an error now this time. Oh, it still did. Okay. So what are we checking for here? Entered email is invalid. If this is true, we want to show this particular paragraph. So we know that what this is showing is if there was no entered name. Oh, this should be email. That's checking for the wrong thing there. So now we might actually be in with a bit of a better shot. So let's reload. These are just important things to check, especially if you're copying and pasting. Where are you getting that data from? Why could that possibly not be working, you know, and trace it back. So I'll add in a name, and then I'll say just Lilly, and let's see what happens. Okay, so that did not work. And then what about if I Okay, well, name isn't blank, but that's okay. We do an @ now we're not getting that message. So it looks like it is recognizing. Oh, and now we have it back again because it set it. So now I know why we're getting that. We're still getting the error message come up after the fact because it has set its memory of this box to nothing, but it hasn't reciprocated that back out on the screen. So we still have text in here, but only because we have only cleared it half of the way. So in our submit form handler, when we submit that form, we have a handler function that is running. That function is here, form submission handler, which takes in the event where setting the entered name was touched to true. I should also set the email was touched to true. So set entered email touched true. We want to prevent the default event propagation. That's fine. And then if the entered name is valid, return. If the entered name is valid, if it is not valid, just get out of this function. And I'll say or, although finding the or is always a great little piece of, it's just great fun I have looking for this thing. Okay, great. So there's our or symbol. So or if the entered email is invalid. Entered email. So if either one of these is false, we'll just come out of this submission handler and just leave it for the time being. So if the entered email is invalid too, great. We'll just leave this function because we just return back out again. And then if that's not the case, if they are indeed valid, we want to set everything back to false. So now and set the forms back to an empty string, but still we are still not sending this back out. We don't have a value property on our input here in order to actually reflect that value coming back out on the screen. So I still think that might be a problem, but this might be better. So now if we try Lily, and okay, so we have nothing, cool, we get empty email address. What if we remove Lily? Okay, cool, cannot be blank. What if we enter Lily again? Great. What if we just enter Lily into email with no @ symbol? It did tell us, please enter a valid email address. Okay, and what does it think? And it thinks that this is still blank because we still haven't fed that. The taking away the values, when we come in here on the submission handler, once we press this submit button, it wipes the memory of having that text there. So although we still see it, it thinks that there's nothing there, which is why we're getting please enter name cannot be blank. So we just need to complete the circuit and feed the information all the way around. So we'll do that. Great. Okay, so here as well, form is valid is a switch that's coming on and off, and we have a loop here that is setting this form is valid to true if the entered name is valid, but we've also now added in our entered email, and the validity of the form relies on this variable as well, so we should add this in. So now we don't want an or. It's not if one or the other is going to be valid, which is what we seen in the last case. If one or the other is invalid, the whole form just return, get out of that submission handler, because we don't need to worry about setting things to empty, because one or the other, doesn't matter which, is currently invalid. Whereas for the validity, in this case, for this if statement, we're using an and, because both of them have to be true. If entered name is valid and if entered name is invalid, then our entered email is valid, then the form can be seen as valid. It's not an or. If we just have a name, if name or email is valid, well, that still doesn't mean the form is valid. If name and email are valid, well, then the form is valid, which is why we're using an and symbol here. And then we can just add entered email. Email is valid. So great, cool. We're doing pretty good. Okay, cool. So yeah, that's sort of what's going on there. If I just reload this, let's do one more test. We'll have Lily. Let's just leave the email blank. Okay, we get our message. What if we get rid of this? Okay, it cannot be blank. Then we'll type in Lily. Cool. Email, I'll type in Lily. Let's see. Now our form should not be submittable because we are checking the form validity on whether the email is valid and the name is valid now. And where this is coming from is checking that there is an @ symbol in the email. That's where how we're getting this variable to begin with. So this would be false if we didn't have an @ which is what we're seeing now. We don't have an @ our form isn't allowing us to submit it. And then the entered name is valid is checking that there is indeed something typed into that name box. Your name could be anything now. It could be the number 1. That's the only check we have, is just that it's not empty at the moment. So that's fine. And then because that's the functionality that we've programmed, you would put harder checks on name and emails and stuff like that for a live site. I mean, it would be recommended. So then if we just check where this form is valid, variable boolean is being used, because we can see it's an on-off switch here. We start off with it being false, and then if we do indeed have a name and an email, it's switched to true. So if we go and check where this is being used, you can see down here our button will be disabled if that form is invalid. So that's all hooking up, that's all acting nicely, it's behaving well. So even if I do a space here, because we haven't got proper validation on this email, and just add an @ there you go. We have ticked the boxes that we have laid out that we needed to be ticked in order to say that this form is valid. As I was saying, in a normal real live website, you would make these more stringent checks. You wouldn't just say, oh, if there's an @ because that's still not a valid email address. But you can use regexes and stuff where you get the exact right pattern and you check that there's some numbers, some digits, some key presses, letters, and then the @ symbol, and then there's a dot, and you can do much bigger checks than just simply this. And but just to get all of this functionality going and to get a basis on, okay, is it switching on and off at the right times? We're making huge progress here, so that's great. Lovely. Okay. So let's just check as well. Excuse him, what? Spilled water all over myself. So, we also need, I just noticed here we have this name input classes. That should be email input classes, because we're doing slightly different checks on both. So we want to use this email input classes, and based on whether the email is invalid, not on the name. So I'm surprised I didn't notice that from the functionality of the page, but I did not. So instead down here we will use email input classes, and how we're doing this is a class name here, and it's calling out email input classes, which is just either setting the invalid class in addition to the form control class if indeed the form is invalid. So that's what's going on there. So cool. Okay, so one thing we might notice from this particular form, from the form we're setting up, is we just have a name and an email here. They're the only two input boxes we have, and we can see there's a lot of code duplication going on in this whole component. So, we're just managing everything, using state, we're tracking whether it's valid or invalid. We're doing a lot of duplication. Although we're looking at two different things here, we're doing a lot of duplication. just for each of these input fields. There's very little differences between them, so it could be bundled in a better way, in a more efficient way, to make this just a better approach. So one of the ways we can do this is by creating our own custom hook, and then we can keep all of this state tracking and state management in the hook, and we can use it depending on how we see fit. So we could call it for the name input and also for the email input box. So that's what we're going to implement, is just a better way of doing this. But just to get the feel for how it is that we're validating both of these forms, we've done it out in longhand, but this can now be simplified. So that's what we're going to do next. So as I mentioned, we're going to do this using hooks. So the first thing that we'll do is create a new folder and call this folder hooks from within our main source file here. So we have hooks, perfect, and then we will create our new file, which is going to be our use input hook. And a hook is just a JS file, so it's how you set it up then that will determine whether or not it's a hook. So we'll just start off by, as always, declaring our standard function here. So we'll create our constant arrow function to define this particular component. So we'll say const use input, which is just going to be a standard old arrow function like we've seen this whole time. So we'll just open that up like that, and then we'll export. This should actually be equal to, is equal to this function, this arrow function. And then we will export our use default, because it's the default export for this page, and then use input like so we can use this elsewhere. And then we're going to just copy over some of the logic that we have in our simple input. So the first thing I'll do is I'll copy over the entered name and the entered name touched use state declarations that we have in our simple input. So I'll add them to this function call instead in here. And then we just need to import useState in order to actually use this. Yeah, so we just want to then import useState from React. Like this, useState from React, perfect. And then once we have them, we'll continue to copy over information. So the next thing that we want to copy is our entered email is valid, and our entered name is valid, and our name input is valid. So we'll copy these over as well and paste them in here. I'll actually just cut and paste in here now. So then what we can do as well is we want to keep this generic. This is a hook that's going to be used in many different places in our code. So keeping it specific to an email or a name, we want to extrapolate out that now and keep it general. So instead we will say entered value, which just makes more sense because we're looking at the specific value where we're going to add this hook on our specific input. So it could be an email, it could be a name, it could be an address, it could be many different things. So we'll just say entered value here, so rather than the actual name. So we'll say set entered value as well. And then we will, rather than saying entered name touched, we can just say is touched. Is this field touched? So is touched, and set is touched down here. So cool. Great. So down here, those generic changes can also be named. So rather than it being entered name is valid, we'll just say here value is valid. Value. So the entered value is valid. And we don't want to do this check anymore. Now we want to do a different check. And we'll also just, rather than saying if the input is invalid, here we'll say has error. So does it have an error? Yeah. Okay, cool. So what we'll do here is what we want to do instead when we're checking if the value is valid. We want this component to stay, you know, being able to use it for in different places. So therefore, the way we will check the validity of the current input that we're talking about, we'll pass in a function here. So we'll call this function validate value. And once we've passed this in, then what we can do is we can use this function, and which we will pass in from the outside, and this is what we will then run. Whichever function has been passed in, we'll run it, and that will then tell us whether the value is valid or not. And then here we'll pass the entered value that's come in. Cool. And then what we want to do is obviously check instead here if the value is valid. So if the value is valid, if the value is not valid, then has error is true. Or if the is touched, hasn't been touched, then that should fix that for us. So set is touched, cool. And then what we want to do is return. So we'll return the value. We're just going to return key value pair. So entered value and has error, which is just going to be the error. Okay, so what I'll also do is bring over our blur functions that we had as well. So in here we had our name input change handler. Yeah, so we want to copy this and paste it in over here, and also our blur function. So enter name input blur handler. So we'll copy those over. We're just fleshing this out, adding the functionality to its own custom hook so that we can more easily reuse this and we don't have to call out all these names every time we're using an input. And here we want to say set entered value, and this will be on the value change handler. And also then on the value blur handler value. There we go. And this is going to be from the set entered value. So set is touched. So that's what we're using down here. And then what we want to do is pass these back out so we can use these. So we've returned them out so we know whether or not these things have been set. So whether we have our value and whether or not the form has been touched or not. So we can pass those through. So we'll just say value change handler and input blur handler. So we have value change handler, and I'm going to make this input blur handler because it's the input that it's actually doing that on, not the value itself. Like so. Great, so now just from this little bit of setup, we can already start using this custom hook. So we have our custom hook here, which is for an input. On an input, we use this custom hook, and now we can actually implement that and see how it is working. So let's do that. Okay. So we'll import our use import. Use input. Cool. And then what we will do, so in here in our simple input, we're going to actually use this. So we'll say const declare an object, and we will equal this to use input, and just like our regular hooks, we call that. So great. And we want to extract our information, so we want to extract our value, and we'll call this entered name. We'll pull out our has error, and we'll call this name input has error. And also extract out those handlers then as well. So I'll just bring this down so it's a bit easier to see. So we have our has error. We're just pulling out these different things that we can use within this hook. So then we have our value change handler, and we will call this name change handler. Name change handler. And also then we have our input blur handler, and we'll call this input change handler. Cool. Okay. Or name, sorry, name blur handler we should call this. And we also just need to pass in this function, our validate value function. So what we'll do in here, so seeing as this is for our name, this one is for our name, we have our entered name, our name input has error. So what we will do is the function that we want to pass through is to take the value that's been entered in and check if that value is valid, if it is indeed a valid name. And how we were checking for the validity of that name was just doing the trim on it. So we'll do value.trim, same as we did when we were actually checking the validity of this name, and we'll say is it equal to, or is it not equal to, I should say, an empty string. Just like that. Perfect. Cool. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so now we can get rid of the name stuff. So we had the two name state tracking over in the simple input, but we've already removed them, so that's okay. Cool. Okay, so actually what we also want to send back out is to check whether or not the value is valid. So we can add another one here and just say is valid. This is what's being passed out of that hook again. So we have is valid and value is valid. Value is valid, yep. And then we can use that over in our component. Yeah. Okay, so now entered name is valid can be still used down here. That's perfectly fine because we have our same is valid tracking coming now from our hook, which is coming from pulling this information out from the hook. And then also when we call it our use input hook, we are passing it through this function, and this function is then being called within our hook. So here's our use input hook, and we can see that we have our validate value function being ran down here. So we have the validate value function being ran, and what it's taking in is the entered value, so whatever value has been entered, and that's when it's running that function on the value that has been entered, and that's how we get our value is valid constant to switch to true, then that it is indeed valid. So that's sort of how I'm following that down there, what is actually happening here. So cool. Okay, so now we have our name change handler, so, and also our input blur handler, which is all the computation is being done within our hook. But before, we were using our name change, our specific handler, for checking whether or not we had a name in there. So now down in our input, where we were used to be using this name input blur handler and our name input change handler, we are now getting those from the hook, so from our name change handler. And the same is going for our name blur handler, so we will use that instead down in our particular input field. So perfect, and we can save that. And we also use okay. So we'll also just clean up some more of this code. So what we have going on is in our submission handler here, we were checking if the name was touched. We don't need that anymore, or if the email is touched, because that's coming from somewhere else. So we'll get rid of them. But we do also want to be able to reset our form, but we'll do that back in our hook because we're handling all this in our hook now. So then we'll say const reset is another arrow function. And what we will do in here is just reset those values. So we do what we did here. Although rather than being our set entered name, this is just going to be entered value. And this is set back to nothing. And then we have, or just an empty string, I should say. And then we also have our is touched, which is set to false. So that's how we reset this now. So I'll also just remove them from our form submission handler because we don't want to do that there anymore. Yeah, so we also just want to expose that back out and return it back out from the hook itself so we can actually use this reset function. So once called, we can use it. So we'll add it down there in order to send it back out. And then we can use this. So we'll just call reset. But first we need to actually add it to that input array that we're getting in. So here we want to say back up in our name. So this is where we've now declared this constant, which is just an object, which is collecting all this data from our hook. So in here we'll add reset and we'll just say name input reset is the name we want to give this reset function in this particular instance. So now we can use this down below and just say name input reset back in our form submission handler. So in here, name input reset, and we'll call that. And rather than using the name input is invalid, we have a new name for this now. So our new name is if the name input has an error. So if it has an error, that's when we want to switch on the invalid class. So we'll use that instead. So now, if we reload, we have a few errors. So on line 26, we have set entered name. Oh yeah, so we can get rid of this now. We do not have the set entered name useState anymore in here. We got rid of that, and we also got rid of our name input blur handler. So if we get rid of both of those and save again, this should still behave as it was. Okay, great. So look, we still have that same validation, and it's all coming from our hook now, which means we could get rid of a good few functions in our simple input JS. So that's great. Cool, so now I'm going to just do the same thing with the email. So all we need to do is call and use this same custom hook that we've already created. So I can literally just copy and paste this, right? Because this is calling. Well, let me type it out and explain what I'm doing. So we want to have a const object that we're defining, and where we're getting this from is by running the use input hook. So there we go, we pass in our brackets, and we're going to need a function in here. So the function that we're expecting is the validate value function. So how we validate the email is we do value. This is an arrow function we're providing, and it's going to be value dot includes the @ symbol. The same as what we were actually looking at, colludes. The same as what we were looking at for when we were actually testing this email in a more long-winded way. So now in here in our object, we can grab all of these different things that we're returning from our use input, and we can use these in this object and rename them to the names that are appropriate for us. So we have value, which we will call our entered email, because this is for the email box, so entered email. Then we have our is valid, which is going to be our entered email is valid. Then we have our has error, which is going to tell us whether our email input has error. Then we have our value change handler, which is going to be our email change handler now. Change handler. And we have our input blur handler, which is now going to be our email blur handler. So the first thing I'm going to do, and also our reset, which is going to be email input reset. So the first thing I'm going to do is use these handlers and our value change handlers down where we're supposed to be using them. So now we are actually doing this from within our hook. So if we can see here, we have our value change handler, and that's checking the setting the entered value from what's coming in from that event. So the same action is happening, but we've just pulled it out. So now we want this to be on our email change handler down in our input, so we can see our email change handler here. We'll just change that for our new email change handler that's being done from the hook. And then we have our email blur handler, which again is just checking whether or not that field has been touched. So we instead want to run this function on blur of our email input box. So then if we just go back up, what we also want to do is get rid of all these. We don't need to manage the state of any of these anymore. Our form is valid is false. That's still on the entered email is valid, and the entered name is valid because we call these the same thing, so that's fine. We can also get rid of these blur handlers. We are tracking that in our hook now. We are doing those those checks to check whether or not we've touched or it's valid, so we can take that out as well. And then here we have entered name is valid and entered email is invalid. So what we will put instead in here is entered email is valid. So we will copy and paste that down into this if statement. So if our entered email is valid or is not valid, so this is a not, or our entered name is valid, is not valid, then we just want to come out, so that's fine. And then in the case that it is valid, once we submit, we want to reset these, so we'll call our email input reset function, which is just setting that back to blank and saying it hasn't been touched. And then the same is going to happen down here for our entered email is invalid. Instead, this is now our email input has error that we are going to use down here. So, and in the case that our email input does have an error, we want to set the invalid class on that input itself. So okay, and now what else are we missing? So on line 68 we have entered email is invalid is not defined. So let's go to line 68. Oh yeah, so here this particular variable that we're using no longer exists. So instead what we want to do is check whether or not the email has errors, and that will tell us whether or not we need to show that particular error. So instead we'll use this email input has error, which is going to say whether or not there is an error. It's a flag that's going to tell us yes or no. So now we should be in a bit of a better place. So let's see how we're getting on. Okay, so we still have a few errors here. Let's just do a hard reload, or just reload. Okay, just reloading worked. Cool. So great. So there we go. Our hook has been implemented, and now we are doing this with much less code and just extrapolating out that logic. So it makes sense, you know, to just have all of that in its own component because it's doing a specific thing, and then our form can just be our form. We don't need all of that confusing our form component. So great. Okay. Okay. Okay, yes, I knew we were missing that. I absolutely knew that. I was just waiting to see. So as you can see from this object up here, we have our value of entered name, which isn't being used at the moment, and entered email. They're grayed out. They're not actually being currently used. So we need to pass this down into our input, and then that should feed back. That's the final step that we were missing before, where we didn't have the value being updated on this input, so therefore we weren't aware when it was wiped back to 0 because we weren't feeding back that information. So if I just add in a value field, and the value is going to be our entered name, and then for our email one it's going to be our entered email, so we can add that in, entered name and entered email, like so. And now when we submit, these should return back to nothing because that's what we've told it to do, and it's all hooked up now. So if I type in Lily, I should get rid of the error. Great. If I type in Lily, I should not get rid of this error because we do not have an @ symbol. Okay, if I add an @ symbol, great, the error goes away. And now on submission, both of these boxes should be cleared because we've linked it back up, right? Oh, shite. Well, that didn't work, but that's okay. So That's all right. So entered value is not a function. Why isn't it? So in our reset, we're getting the error that entered value is not a function. Well, we don't want it to be a function. We just want to set our entered value back to nothing. So let's have a look at that. So we have our use input here. This is the hook we've created, and on our reset, we want to set the entered value back to nothing. Which that all looks okay to me. But it is not. So we can also get rid of this useState import from this particular component because we're not tracking the state of anything in there anymore. That's okay. I'll just save everything. Okay. Okay. So. Okay. Let's see what's going down. Okay. So entered value. So here's our use input. Here is our entered value, which we should be passing in to our validate value function, whatever function comes in from outside. Okay. And our value is just our entered value. Okay, so that's what it is. Yes, of course, entered value is not a function. We should be using the set entered value down here. So we want to set entered value to nothing by calling set entered value. That's how we change the entered value itself. So we need to call this set entered value as the function. The entered value is the value itself. So we want to use the function set entered value to set the entered value. You use the set entered value in order to set the entered value. So instead we were just calling the entered value. We were doing it slightly incorrectly there. So now, cool, great, we're getting closer. So now we have another error that's coming up, entered value. So that's fine. Let's just do a hard reload because I know entered value should be fixed now. So now if I leave nothing and nothing, we can't submit. Let's type in a name. Let's type in an email. Let's see if now we can submit. No, because it's still not valid. Great. So now this should be considered valid. And if we submit, we're getting is touched is not a function now. So have we done the exact same thing? We have indeed. We're just passing is touched. That's incorrect. We need to use the function to set the is touched variable. So instead down here, if we actually call the function and pass it the value false, that's updating this is touched to false. So now if we save and we try that one more time, I think we should be good. So now we'll type in Lilly. I'll type in Lilly at, and let's submit. Ooh, 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 ooh. Yeah, that's great because we also seen that the name and the email has disappeared now. So again, because we added this value back on our actual form and we told it where that value was coming from, once we've submitted the form, we set the value back to blank, we set the is touched to false. So that should all happen on the submission of that form. And because we hadn't got this one simple property on our input to say which value it was, where's the value coming from, so once we submit now, that entered name has been changed. It's now been set back to nothing, and the value can therefore display that. It can show it back to the user. So we've also managed that by seeing that here when we submit the form, it does indeed get set back to nothing, and that's because we have added that value property on our input. So there we go. Perfect, guys. Brilliant. So we've just come up on the hour and I think we've made some great progress today. We have extrapolated out all of our functionality for validating these input boxes into its own component, and on submission we are clearing the form, clearing the errors and moving on with our lives. So we'll continue with this tomorrow now with Max's React course. And thanks so much for joining me, guys. Really appreciate it, and have an absolutely wonderful, wonderful day. Yours, Lilly Code. Thanks a million, guys. Bye.